"There seems to be a problem with your wedding account authorization," the venue coordinator said. And in that instant, every plan I had spent 4 years building began to unravel. My name is Claire Whitmore, and 3 months before what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, I learned that sometimes the people smiling in your family photos are the same people quietly reaching for things that don't belong to them. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon while I was finishing my lunch break in the accounting office where I worked. I almost ignored it because I was behind on a quarterly report, but something made me answer. The coordinator sounded nervous. She asked if I was available to verify a request involving changes to the financial authorization connected to my wedding package. At first, I thought she had the wrong client. I had personally handled every payment, every deposit, every signature. No one else had access. "What request?" I asked. There was a brief pause. Then she said a name that made my stomach tighten. Margaret Sullivan, my future mother-in-law. I stared at the spreadsheet on my screen without seeing any of it. Margaret had always been involved in everything. Opinions about flowers, opinions about catering, opinions about guest lists. But finances were different. The wedding fund belonged to me. Every dollar in it came from years of careful saving. "Why would Margaret be contacting you?" I asked. The coordinator sounded relieved that I seemed surprised. She said she was helping manage final arrangements and wanted information about transferring authorization privileges. My hand tightened around the phone. Transfer authorization privileges. Those words echoed in my head. I forced myself to remain calm and asked several questions. The coordinator explained that Margaret had called twice during the previous week. She had been polite, professional, confident enough that no one initially questioned her involvement. Apparently, she had asked detailed questions about balances, payment schedules, cancellation policies, and account access. Questions only someone with a financial interest would normally ask. When the call ended, I sat motionless for nearly a minute. Around me, coworkers talked about weekend plans and coffee orders. Everything looked normal, yet something felt wrong, deeply wrong. I told myself there had to be an innocent explanation. Maybe Margaret was trying to help. Maybe she misunderstood something. Maybe Ethan had asked her to coordinate details. But even as I searched for excuses, memories began resurfacing. Margaret asking how much the venue cost. Margaret asking how much I had saved. Margaret casually mentioning that weddings were family events and family resources should be shared. At the time, I had laughed those comments away. Now they felt different, sharper. After work, I drove home through heavy traffic, replaying the conversation over and over. Ethan texted me a photo of a restaurant menu and asked where I wanted to go for dinner. I stared at the message and wondered whether he knew about the phone calls, whether he had any idea what his mother was doing, or whether he knew far more than I realized. That night, I opened the binder where I kept every wedding document. Contracts, receipts, payment confirmations. Everything was organized in color-coded folders because that was how I handled stress. I liked order, predictability, control. But as I turned page after page, a question kept growing louder in my mind. Why was Margaret trying to gain access to money that wasn't hers? The next morning, I called the venue again and requested copies of every communication connected to my account. The coordinator agreed. An hour later, an email arrived. Attached were several messages I had never seen before. I clicked the first attachment, expecting a misunderstanding. What I found instead was the beginning of something much worse. I opened the first attachment, expecting confusion. What I found instead felt like the first crack in a foundation I had trusted for years. The email was from Margaret to the venue coordinator. Her tone was friendly, almost cheerful. She introduced herself as Ethan Sullivan's mother and explained that she was helping oversee final wedding arrangements. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. Then I reached the second message. Margaret was asking detailed questions about payment schedules, refund policies, and authorization requirements. She specifically wanted to know what documentation would be necessary if someone else needed to manage the account. I read the message twice, then 3 times. The coordinator's response was professional and cautious. She explained that only the account holder could make financial decisions unless legal authorization had been provided. That should have ended the conversation. It did not. Margaret replied again. This time she sounded more persistent. She claimed that family circumstances might require changes and asked whether exceptions were ever made. My chest tightened. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. Outside my apartment window, traffic moved through the late afternoon sunlight. Somewhere nearby, a lawnmower hummed. Ordinary sounds, ordinary life. Yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. I continued reading. There were more emails, more questions, more attempts to gather information. None of them succeeded, but that was not what bothered me most. What bothered me was the effort. Nobody accidentally sends 5 emails asking about account access. Nobody repeatedly calls a venue to discuss financial control without a reason. I closed the document and walked into the kitchen. My coffee had gone cold hours earlier. I poured it into the sink and stood there longer than necessary. Memories began arranging themselves differently in my mind. Small conversations I had ignored, little comments I had dismissed. During a family dinner 3 months earlier, Margaret had asked exactly how much the wedding venue cost. When I gave a vague answer, she laughed and said that young people today spent too much money on one day. A few weeks later, she asked how much I had left in my wedding account after paying deposits. I remembered feeling slightly uncomfortable, but Ethan had brushed it off. "That is just how Mom is," he said. At the time, I wanted peace more than answers. Looking back, I realized how often I had done that. I had chosen comfort over curiosity. The truth was that this wedding fund represented much more than centerpieces and dinner plates. It was the result of 4 years of discipline. While friends booked vacations, I worked extra shifts. While coworkers upgraded cars, I drove the same reliable sedan. Every month, I moved money into a dedicated savings account. Sometimes it was $50, sometimes $500. Every contribution represented a choice. Every dollar represented a sacrifice. Nobody in the Sullivan family had contributed to that fund. Not Margaret, not Richard, not Nicole, not even Ethan. We had agreed from the beginning that I would manage wedding expenses while he focused on paying down student loans and building his business. I never complained about that arrangement because I believed we were building a future together. Now I found myself wondering whether everyone viewed that future the same way. My phone buzzed. A text from Ethan appeared on the screen. "Mom says she found a great florist. Want me to have her send details?" I stared at the message. Under different circumstances, it would have seemed harmless. Instead, it felt like another piece of a puzzle I was only beginning to see. I typed a short response and set the phone down. Then I reopened the email chain and noticed something I had missed before. Attached to the final message was a document Margaret had attempted to submit. The file name alone was enough to make my pulse quicken. The attachment was labeled Family Authorization Draft. For several seconds, I simply stared at the words. Then I clicked it open. The document was incomplete, which was probably the only reason it had never gone anywhere. Large sections were blank. Signature lines remained unsigned. Certain legal fields were empty, but the intent behind it was impossible to misunderstand. Someone had begun preparing paperwork that would allow another person to communicate with vendors regarding my wedding finances. My wedding finances. Not shared family money. Not a joint account. Mine. I felt a strange calm settle over me as I read through the pages. It was the same feeling I used to get during difficult audits at work. The moment when confusion disappeared and facts took over. Emotions could wait. Facts came first. I printed every email and every attachment. Then I placed them neatly inside a folder. The more organized I became, the more unsettled I felt. Because organization created clarity, and clarity was revealing things I did not want to see. That evening, Ethan came over carrying takeout from our favorite Italian restaurant. Normally, I would have been excited. We had spent years building small traditions together. Friday dinners, Sunday morning coffee, long walks through the neighborhood discussing plans for the future. I wanted to believe those things still meant what they once had. He set the food on the kitchen counter and smiled. "You look tired," he said. "Long day." I considered showing him the documents immediately. Instead, I watched him for a moment. Sometimes people reveal more when they do not know they are being observed. He seemed relaxed, comfortable, completely unaware of the storm building in my mind. During dinner, I casually mentioned that the venue had contacted me about account questions. Ethan paused for half a second before taking another bite. It was such a small reaction that another person might not have noticed it. I did. "Oh," he said. "About what?" "Authorization requests." His fork stopped moving. Just briefly. Then he shrugged. "Probably wedding paperwork. There is always something." I nodded and changed the subject. But inside, another piece of the puzzle shifted into place. If someone had falsely used my name, Ethan would have been angry. If someone had interfered with our plans, he would have been concerned. Instead, he seemed eager for the conversation to end. Later that night, after he left, I sat alone at my dining table and opened my wedding budget spreadsheet. Every expense was listed in precise detail: venue deposits, catering reservations, photography payments, floral estimates, transportation costs. Years of planning stretched across dozens of rows and columns. Looking at those numbers reminded me of the sacrifices behind them. The weekends spent working overtime, the vacations postponed, the impulse purchases skipped. I remembered standing in grocery store aisles comparing prices to save a few extra dollars. I remembered declining expensive nights out because I had a goal. Every decision had been made with faith in a future I thought I understood. Around 10 o'clock, my phone rang. It was Jessica Reed, my closest friend since college. She immediately noticed something was wrong. I told her everything: the emails, the phone calls, the authorization draft. She listened quietly. When I finished, there was a long silence. Finally, she asked a question I had been avoiding. "Claire, are you sure this is only Margaret?" I looked down at the printed documents scattered across my table. I wanted to say yes. I wanted one clear villain and one simple explanation. But nothing about the situation felt simple anymore. The authorization draft had not appeared out of thin air. The questions about my savings had not happened by accident. Someone had been gathering information for months, maybe longer. As I prepared to put the documents away for the night, I noticed a date stamped near the bottom of one page. The draft had been created nearly 6 weeks earlier. 6 weeks before the venue called me. 6 weeks before I discovered any of this. Which meant they had been planning something long before I ever suspected a problem. The date on that document stayed in my mind all weekend. 6 weeks. That was not a spontaneous mistake. That was preparation, planning, coordination. I arrived at work Monday morning determined to stop guessing and start paying attention. For the first time since becoming engaged, I looked at every interaction with the Sullivan family through a different lens. The results were unsettling. During lunch, I reviewed old text messages. At first, they seemed ordinary. Margaret asking about vendor contracts. Margaret asking whether refunds were available if plans changed. Margaret asking if wedding accounts were protected by insurance. Months earlier, I had interpreted those questions as curiosity. Now they felt like research. That evening, I attended a family dinner at Margaret and Richard's house. The atmosphere appeared normal. Richard grilled steaks in the backyard. Nicole talked about a promotion she hoped to receive. Ethan laughed at a story from work. Anyone looking from the outside would have seen a close family enjoying a pleasant evening together. I sat quietly and observed. It did not take long to notice something strange. Every major wedding decision became a group discussion the moment I entered the room. Margaret asked about catering costs. Richard asked whether I had paid the final venue installment. Nicole wondered aloud what would happen if guest numbers changed unexpectedly. None of the questions were inappropriate on their own. Together, they felt coordinated, like pieces of a script everyone knew except me. I answered politely while giving away as little information as possible. The less I said, the more interested they seemed to become. At one point, Margaret smiled and placed a hand over mine. "You know," she said, "after marriage, financial decisions become family decisions." The comment was delivered casually, warmly, yet something about it made me uncomfortable. Before, I would have ignored the feeling. This time I did not. I simply nodded and watched Ethan's reaction. He did not disagree. He did not correct her. He did not even seem surprised by the statement. He just continued eating. A few minutes later, I excused myself and stepped onto the back patio. The evening air felt cooler than I expected. Through the kitchen window, I could see the family continuing their conversation. They looked comfortable together, familiar, united. For the first time, I wondered whether I had been standing outside a circle I never realized existed. On the drive home, my phone connected automatically to the car speakers. A voicemail notification appeared. It had arrived earlier that afternoon from an unfamiliar number. I played it. The message was brief. A woman introduced herself as an employee from another wedding vendor. She apologized for missing me and requested confirmation regarding recent questions about account access. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. Another vendor, not just the venue. When I reached my apartment, I immediately returned the call. The employee explained that someone claiming to represent the Sullivan family had contacted their office asking about payment authority and contract modifications. She had become suspicious because the caller seemed unusually interested in financial procedures. After hanging up, I sat alone in silence. 2 vendors, multiple calls, weeks of activity. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Then I opened my email and found something new waiting in my inbox. It was from the venue coordinator. She had located additional correspondence that had not been included in the original file. Attached was a forwarded message chain involving several members of the Sullivan family. As I stared at the subject line, I felt a chill run through me. Nicole Sullivan's name was listed among the participants. For a long moment, I could not bring myself to open the attachment. Nicole's name changed everything. Until then, I had been trying to convince myself that Margaret was acting alone. Maybe she was overstepping. Maybe she was trying to control details she had no business controlling. But if Nicole was involved too, this was no longer about one person's poor judgment. It suggested conversations, planning, agreement. I finally clicked the file. The message chain contained several emails exchanged over the previous month. Most of them were frustratingly vague. They discussed wedding logistics, vendor communication, and financial responsibilities without directly saying what anyone intended to do. Yet certain phrases stood out immediately. One message from Nicole mentioned that it would be easier once the accounts were consolidated. Another referred to making sure decisions could be handled within the family. I read those lines several times. The wording was careful, deliberately careful. Nothing explicitly crossed a legal line. Nothing directly stated that they wanted control of my money. But the implication sat there like a shadow between every sentence. Then I reached a message from Richard. It was only 2 lines long. He wrote that they needed to make sure unnecessary funds were not wasted and that Ethan agreed adjustments should be considered before final payments were made. Ethan agreed. I stared at those 2 words until the screen blurred. Ethan agreed. I felt neither anger nor panic. Not yet. What I felt was disappointment. Deep, heavy disappointment. For weeks I had been searching for explanations that would leave him untouched by all of this. I had been creating possibilities that protected the future I thought we shared. But every new piece of information seemed to remove another excuse. I closed the laptop and sat quietly at my kitchen table. Outside, rain had started falling against the windows. The apartment felt unusually still. I looked around at the wedding invitations stacked neatly on a shelf. The sample centerpiece photographs. The seating chart drafts. Evidence of a future I had been building one careful decision at a time. Suddenly those items felt less like plans and more like questions. The next morning I called Jessica before work. She listened as I described the emails. When I finished, she was silent for several seconds. Finally, she asked whether I had spoken directly to Ethan. I admitted that I had not. Not because I was afraid of the conversation, because I wanted more facts first. I wanted certainty. Jessica understood immediately. She knew me well enough to recognize that once I reached a conclusion, I rarely changed course. That afternoon, another memory surfaced while I was reviewing invoices during lunch. About 2 months earlier, Ethan had casually suggested adding his mother as an emergency contact for vendor communication. At the time, it seemed harmless. Practical, even. I remembered declining because all vendor correspondence already came directly to me. Ethan had not argued. But looking back, I realized Margaret's first email to the venue had been sent only days later. The timing felt impossible to ignore. That evening, Ethan called and asked if I wanted to meet for coffee after work the next day. His voice sounded normal, relaxed, familiar, the same voice I had trusted for years. I agreed without hesitation. If he was involved, I needed to hear him explain it. If he was not involved, I wanted the chance to prove myself wrong. After we ended the call, I opened my folder one more time and organized every document in chronological order. Dates, emails, phone logs, notes from vendor conversations. The timeline was becoming remarkably clear. What had once looked like isolated incidents now formed a pattern stretching back weeks, maybe longer. As I reviewed the final page, one detail caught my attention. A vendor note from nearly 2 months earlier recorded a request for information that had not come from Margaret or Richard or Nicole. The name listed beside the inquiry belonged to Ethan Sullivan. Seeing Ethan's name on that vendor note felt different from everything that came before. Margaret's involvement had been troubling. Richard's participation had been disappointing. Nicole's presence had been suspicious. But Ethan was the person I had planned to marry. The person who knew exactly how hard I had worked to build that wedding fund. I sat at my desk long after everyone else had left the office, staring at the document. The note itself was brief. It recorded a phone inquiry regarding payment procedures and contract flexibility. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal. Yet the fact that Ethan had made the inquiry without mentioning it to me changed the entire picture. By the time I drove to meet him for coffee the following evening, I had already made an important decision. I was finished confronting problems with emotions. From that moment forward, I would deal only in facts. Ethan arrived a few minutes late and greeted me with the same easy smile I had seen hundreds of times before. We ordered coffee and sat near the front window. For several minutes we discussed ordinary things. Work schedules, weekend plans, weather forecasts. The conversation felt strangely artificial, like two actors reading lines from a script neither of them believed. Finally, I asked a simple question. Have you contacted any of the wedding vendors recently? His expression remained calm. Too calm. Maybe once or twice, he said. Why? I nodded slowly. Just curious. He relaxed immediately. That reaction told me more than any answer could have. Someone with nothing to hide would have asked why I was asking. Someone with nothing to hide would have been confused. Ethan seemed relieved instead. The realization settled heavily in my chest. As we continued talking, I noticed how carefully he chose his words whenever wedding finances entered the conversation. He spoke about flexibility, family involvement, shared decision-making, concepts that sounded reasonable until you examined them closely. What he never mentioned was ownership. What he never acknowledged was that the money belonged to me. When we parted that evening, he kissed my cheek and told me everything would come together perfectly. I smiled and wished him a good night. Then I walked to my car knowing that I could no longer trust what I was being told. The next morning I took a personal day from work. Not because I was overwhelmed, because I needed information. My first appointment was with an attorney recommended by Jessica. I brought every document I had collected, every email, every note, every communication record. The attorney spent nearly an hour reviewing everything. When he finished, his assessment was straightforward. The wedding fund remained entirely under my control. The contracts were solely in my name. No one could legally access or redirect those funds without my authorization. Hearing those words felt like taking a full breath after weeks underwater. For the first time since the venue coordinator's call, I felt steady. Not because the situation was improving, because I finally understood my position. After leaving the attorney's office, I contacted every vendor connected to the wedding. One by one, I requested additional security measures, password verification, written authorization requirements, direct communication restrictions. Every representative I spoke with was professional and supportive. Several even admitted they had already become uncomfortable with the number of inquiries coming from members of the Sullivan family. By late afternoon, the protections were in place. The accounts were secure. The contracts were secure. The money was secure. Yet as I reviewed the confirmations arriving in my inbox, one thought continued to bother me. If they had been trying this hard to gain access and still failed, what exactly had they planned to do once they succeeded? Once I secured every account, I stopped reacting and started watching. That turned out to be the most revealing decision I made. Over the next 2 weeks, I behaved exactly as everyone expected. I attended family dinners. I responded to wedding group messages. I discussed flower arrangements and seating charts. I smiled in photographs. I nodded during conversations. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. The more relaxed I appeared, the more comfortable the Sullivan family became. It was as if they believed some invisible obstacle had finally disappeared. Margaret became unusually confident. During one Sunday dinner, she spoke about the wedding as though she were the primary organizer. She discussed vendor decisions without consulting me. She suggested budget adjustments for expenses she had never paid. Richard talked about reallocating resources after the ceremony. Nicole joked about how family money always ended up circulating back to family eventually. Each comment was delivered with a smile. Each comment seemed harmless on its own. Together, they painted a picture I could no longer ignore. What surprised me most was Ethan. Instead of correcting them, he quietly supported the conversation. Whenever someone proposed a change involving costs or contracts, he would nod thoughtfully. Whenever Margaret offered opinions about financial decisions, he treated them as reasonable suggestions. He never once reminded anyone that the wedding fund belonged to me. The silence spoke louder than words. One evening, Margaret invited everyone to her house for what she called a planning session. I arrived carrying a notebook and a calm expression. Inside, The dining room table was covered with documents, brochures, and printed estimates. It looked impressive at first glance. Then I realized something unusual. Several pages contained numbers that did not match my actual wedding budget. The differences were significant. Some projected expenses were inflated. Others had been reduced. A few line items had been removed entirely. I listened carefully as Margaret explained her ideas. According to her, certain funds could be redirected more efficiently. According to her, some expenses were unnecessary. According to her, a more practical approach would benefit everyone involved. Everyone involved. That phrase stayed with me, because every recommendation seemed to create advantages for the Sullivan family rather than for the wedding itself. At one point, Richard casually mentioned helping Ethan with future business expenses once the wedding was behind them. Nicole talked about family priorities and long-term planning. No one directly connected those comments to my money. They did not have to. The implication hung in the room like perfume, present but impossible to touch. I kept my expression neutral and asked a few harmless questions. The answers revealed more than they realized. By the end of the evening, I had learned something important. They were not simply interested in controlling wedding decisions. They were already discussing plans that extended beyond the wedding. Plans based on financial assumptions that should never have existed. Driving home that night, I felt an unexpected sense of clarity. For weeks I had been trying to understand whether this situation was the result of misunderstanding, entitlement, or poor judgment. Now I knew. These conversations had happened too often. The assumptions had become too specific. They genuinely believed they would eventually gain influence over resources that belonged to me. The following morning, another email arrived from one of the vendors I had secured earlier. The representative informed me that someone had recently called requesting confirmation of an upcoming payment schedule. The request had been denied because of the security measures I implemented. Attached to the message was a note identifying the caller. This time it was not Margaret. It was Richard Sullivan. Richard's attempt to obtain payment information removed the last trace of doubt I had been carrying. By then, too many people had become involved for any innocent explanation to survive. What surprised me was not that he made the call. What surprised me was how comfortable they had become. It was as if repeated failures had not discouraged them. Instead, they seemed convinced success was only a matter of time. That realization led me to a decision I should have made weeks earlier. I stopped asking what they wanted and started focusing on what I wanted. For 4 years, I had built my future around a vision that included Ethan and his family. Every sacrifice had been tied to that expectation. But expectations are dangerous when they depend on people who do not share the same values. The following week, I reviewed every contract connected to the wedding, the venue agreement, the catering package, the photography reservation, the transportation arrangements, everything. I spent hours reading terms and conditions that I had previously skimmed. For the first time, I paid close attention to cancellation deadlines, refund schedules, and financial obligations. The numbers were surprisingly favorable. Because I had booked well in advance and remained within specific contractual windows, a substantial portion of the funds could still be recovered if plans changed. That discovery stayed in the back of my mind. I did not act immediately. Instead, I continued observing. The Sullivan family remained remarkably confident. Group messages became increasingly focused on future decisions. Margaret discussed post-wedding priorities. Richard referenced long-term opportunities. Nicole joked about how quickly financial resources could disappear if not managed correctly. Even Ethan began speaking differently. He started using phrases like our money and family resources more often. Every time he did, something inside me became a little clearer. One evening, about 3 weeks before the ceremony, I attended another planning dinner. The conversation drifted toward honeymoon plans. Margaret casually suggested shortening the trip to reduce unnecessary expenses. Richard agreed. Ethan nodded. Then Margaret mentioned that the savings could be put toward more practical goals. No one asked my opinion. No one seemed interested in whether I wanted to shorten the trip I had spent years saving for. They discussed my sacrifices as though they already belonged to a committee. I smiled politely and listened. Inside, I reached a conclusion. These were not people preparing to celebrate a marriage. These were people preparing to manage assets they believed would soon be available to them. Later that night, I returned home and opened my laptop. For several hours, I reviewed financial records, legal notes, and vendor policies. By midnight, I had created a detailed plan. It was simple. It was legal. Most importantly, it returned control to the person who had earned it. Over the next several days, I quietly prepared. I organized documents, saved confirmations, backed up correspondence, verified account access. Every step brought a sense of calm I had not felt in months. The anxiety disappeared because uncertainty disappeared with it. For the first time since receiving that original phone call, I knew exactly what I was going to do. Meanwhile, the Sullivan family appeared happier than ever. They talked about the upcoming event with excitement and confidence. They discussed guest arrivals and schedules. They made assumptions about the future as though it had already been decided. I let them. The less resistance they encountered, the more certain they became. Then, exactly 48 hours before the ceremony, I sat down at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, opened the venue contract one final time, and picked up the phone. The venue coordinator recognized my voice immediately. She asked whether everything was all right. I remember looking around my apartment before answering. The wedding invitations were still stacked on the shelf. The seating charts were still tucked inside a binder. The future I had imagined was still visible everywhere I looked. But the trust that future depended on was gone. I would like to cancel the event, I said. There was a brief silence. Then she carefully explained the remaining refund terms. I already knew them. I had reviewed every line repeatedly. When she finished, I authorized the cancellation. The process took less than 15 minutes. 4 years of planning ended with a few signatures and a confirmation email. Strangely, I did not feel devastated. I felt relieved. By the end of the afternoon, the remaining funds were secured and the venue booking was officially terminated. The next step was more difficult. I called Ethan and asked to meet that evening. He arrived looking confused but unconcerned. We sat across from each other at the same coffee shop where we had shared countless conversations about our future. For a moment, I wondered whether he understood what was about to happen. Then I realized it no longer mattered. I placed a folder on the table. Inside were the emails, vendor notes, communication records, and authorization drafts. Ethan's expression changed as he flipped through the pages. The confidence disappeared first, then the excuses, then the silence. When he finally spoke, he claimed his family had only been trying to help. He said there had been misunderstandings. He said everyone wanted what was best for us. I listened quietly. When he finished, I asked a simple question. Why did nobody ask me? He had no answer. Because there was no answer. People who respect you do not work around you. They do not gather information behind your back. They do not make plans involving your money without your knowledge. The conversation ended shortly afterward. Calmly, respectfully, permanently. The following morning my phone began ringing before 8 o'clock. Margaret called first, then Richard, then Nicole. Messages arrived one after another. Some sounded confused. Others sounded angry. A few demanded explanations. Apparently, they had learned the venue reservation no longer existed. Guests had started receiving notifications. Vendors had stopped responding to family inquiries. Assumptions that had been building for months suddenly collided with reality. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. Every decision had been made legally and transparently. There was nothing left to debate. Later that day, Jessica came over with takeout and a bottle of sparkling cider. We sat on my balcony watching the sunset. For the first time in weeks, I felt completely calm. Not because the situation had ended the way I originally wanted. It had not. The wedding was gone. The relationship was gone. The future I expected was gone. But something more important remained. My self-respect. My independence. My ability to walk away before a bad situation became a permanent one. Over the following months, life slowly settled into a new rhythm. The recovered funds became the foundation for goals that actually belonged to me. I focused on work, traveled, reconnected with friends. Most importantly, I stopped measuring success by whether a wedding happened. Sometimes success means recognizing a warning before it becomes a disaster. Looking back now, I am grateful for that first phone call from the venue coordinator. Without it, I might have spent years ignoring the truth. They thought they were positioning themselves to benefit from something I had built. Instead, they revealed exactly who they were before it was too late. And in the end, the most valuable thing I kept was never the money. It was the lesson.